So, hello everyone, welcome back, and I'd like to especially give a special welcome to the new subscribers who came from Suit Yourself's channel after he very kindly mirrored 2 of my videos. So welcome to you, and say hi, Jacob.
And I welcome everyone to Voice of the Revolution Radio to come to learn and to have fun and to engage in subversive agitprop, such as undermining the accepted tenets of Abrahamic religion, which we are doing today.
So, in this series, what we do is we break down the Abrahamic texts, not from what the texts themselves say, but in terms of what they say as related to what other people and other authors around the time and around their area.
Christian, Muslim, and Judaic scholars often don't do, which is actually compare what is said in these texts with contemporaneous sources to actually check them and see if what they're saying has any validity at all.
Yep. So now that we've got that out of the way, let's get started. We're starting on the women of the New Testament with this episode. As far as I can tell, we probably have about 11 episodes left before we get to the end of the Quran.
Are we going to go on to Ahmadiyya?
Yes, we will at some point.
And then we can, I don't know, on to the future. Maybe a new religion will pop up. Oh my god, we can do Mormon. Women in Mormonism. Oh my god, that's going to be, because there's so many of them, because so many wives. So.
Islam has the same problem. So.
No matter what anyone says, no matter the more wives you have, the more money that has to be split multiple ways. That's the bottom line there. That's not easy.
So we're going to be covering Esther and Judith together when we get to the Apocrypha, because they purport to be written at around the same time, and because I forgot Esther and had the New Testament episodes half written by the time I realized I'd forgotten them. So after this episode, or after these next few episodes, I think it's going to be about 4 episodes, we're going to do the apocryphal books, the Midrash, and then we'll be moving on to Islam. So the Gospels are widely accepted to have been written in this order. Mark, soon after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, then Matthew and Luke a few years later at the same time but in different places, then John several decades after that, when the first believers were starting to die, to explain why Jesus hadn't returned yet. The earliest manuscripts of Mark end at chapter 16, verse 8, so it's widely accepted that the last few verses were added at a later date, and we'll go into what that means for the women of the book later. So, Mary, mother of Jesus, is first alluded to in Mark chapter 3, but not by name. It says, starting at verse 31, "Then his brothers and his mother came. Standing outside, they sent to him, calling him. And a multitude was sitting around him, and they said to him, 'Look, your mother and your brothers are outside seeking you.' And he answered them, 'Who is my mother or my brothers?' And he looked around in a circle at those who sat about him, and said, 'Here are my mother and my brothers, for whoever does the will of God is my brother and my sister and my mother.'" In this passage, he's kind of downplaying Mary's importance and uniqueness. Her importance in general is very downplayed in Mark, especially compared to the later Gospels. In addition to the uniqueness of Mary being downplayed by Jesus, the uniqueness of Jesus seems to be downplayed by his family and friends. After wandering the countryside performing miracles, he returns home in Mark 6, only to be greeted with, "Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary, brother of James, of Joses, and Judah, and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us?" And they were offended at him. But Jesus said to them, "A prophet is not without honor, but in his own country, and among his own kin, and in his own house." And he could do no mighty work, save that he laid his hands upon a few sick folk and healed them.
Wow, that's quite Judgy McJudgerson.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a dime a dozen, which is funny, because about the dime a dozen, messiahs that were running around at the time. So maybe that's that reference, who knows?
Yeah, that is basically true. There were tons of messiahs. However, he does still stress the importance of your duty to your family. He says in Mark chapter 11, verse 10, "For Moses said, 'Honor your father and your mother,' and he who curses his father or mother, let him be put to death. But you say, if a man says to his father or mother, 'What profit you might have received from me is korban,' that is, a gift to God, then you no longer compel him to do anything for his father or mother." Korban doesn't actually mean gift. It literally translates to sacrifice. So what the passage is saying is that if you give your money to the temple and religious authorities, instead of giving them to your parents, you're sinning. But it doesn't mean that you should avoid giving to the temple. It says in... Oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, I didn't say anything. What is he saying to you, Sophia? What is Jesus saying?
No, nothing. I just hear like little breaks and stuff, so it's fine. Probably sleep deprived from last week. Or my internet's bad, which is equally likely. Mark chapter 12, verse 41. Now Jesus sat opposite the treasury and saw how the people put money into the treasury, and many who were rich put in much. Then one poor widow came and threw in 2 mites, which makes a quadrans. So he called his disciples to himself and said to them, "Assuredly I say to you that this poor widow has put in more than all those who have given to the treasury. For they all put out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty put in all that she had, her whole livelihood." So Jesus certainly does think that you should be donating to the temple or the church. But he also thinks you should take care of your family. And your family duty doesn't just extend to your father and mother, but to your wife. It says in Mark chapter 10, verses 11 and 12, "Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if a woman divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery." Note that in this passage, both the man and the woman are guilty of adultery. This is going to be different in different passages. However, the duty to your family apparently stops if they are unbelievers or if they don't like your sudden adoption of a monastic lifestyle.
Which is basically the beginning of shunning. The Amish have really perfected that, I have to say.
Yeah. And so, well, the Muslims perfected it a lot more, but
the Muslims maybe were first.
Yes. So this does seem to support that concept, though.
The passage that they use for, do you know, for the Amish, is that the passage or part that they use as justification for that practice?
I don't think so. I think that their justification comes from, I think it's Leviticus or Exodus.
Okay, so something in the Old Testament. Okay.
Yeah, I think so. But the passage that I'm thinking of does actually command you to kill your family if they start talking about other gods.
Well, I've heard okay, well, let me question you here. I have heard conservative Christian commentators in the United States say this about Islam. So you're saying this is also in the New Testament?
It's in the Old Testament, not the New Testament. But honestly, I think most of them haven't read the Bible.
But see, some of them have. Do you think that it's just cognitive dissonance?
Probably.
I didn't stop you, but I wanted to ask you, in that earlier passage, Jesus is mentioned as having sisters. I had no idea about this. Is this widely known, and what do we know about them?
Nothing. We know nothing about them.
The generic flat women just mentioned, not even by name, and we know nothing else.
Yes, and they also appear in Matthew in the exact same capacity. Yes. So
there are some sects that continue to really base their beliefs off of this passage. As far as I know, most Christians today, that is certainly not the practice that they follow. There are many divorces. Most people in this country are Christian. Many people in Europe are Christian, and they remarry. What is their theological justification for this? I know in the Catholic Church, because I came up in that, basically annulment, which means oh, everyone's going to act like it didn't happen. But in terms of non-Catholic, what is their workaround for this?
Again, most people probably just ignore it. The ones that do are, like, the ones that are very strict about it, tend to not let you take communion, like the Catholic Church, until very recently. Didn't allow remarried people to take communion, but for other sects, it's just...
If we just talk about the fundamentals of Christianity, especially in its Gnostic forms, that is so opposite of what, if anything, we can call the, quote, original ethos was of the Church. But, of course, Catholicism comes from the Orthodox branch, which was so different than Gnosticism.
Yeah. Yeah, we're going to be going into Gnosticism with the next episode. So, yeah, it just seems to be something that they try not to think about. There's a lot of cognitive dissonance.
Things. I mean, we're going back and a lot of these godly, divine intonations, which they recognize as the word or inspired word of God, yet they don't live this way. And yet, the same people are often ultra-critical of people outside the tradition.
Funny how that works. So, going back to Mark, it says in Mark chapter 10, verse 29, "Assuredly I say to you that there is no one who has left house or brothers or sisters, or father or mother, or wife or children or lands, for my sake and the gospel's, who shall not receive 100-fold, now in this time, houses, brothers, sisters, mothers, and children and lands, with persecutions, and in the age to come eternal life. But many who are first will be last, and the last first." So, Mark seems to be very focused on the idea that the world is ending right now, and that there will be some kind of messianic era.
Which did not happen, obviously.
Which didn't happen. But the Christian idea from it, of it, is slightly different than the Jewish one now, several hundred years later. But what he probably was thinking at the time, the author of Mark, was that the Messiah was going to start an era of peace where the entire world would be subject to him and would come to bring offerings to God, like it says in Isaiah, "New moon after new moon, Sabbath after Sabbath, all flesh shall come to worship before the Lord in Jerusalem." And so this was probably his concept. And a lot of Jewish sources also have all non-Jews being slaves to Jews. So so this is probably also going into Mark's thought process, is that these people who are going to be added to your family, especially like children and wives, are probably going to be your slaves. Your Gentile slaves.
Which is how the modern family, well, modern, but the quote-unquote traditional family was established, but patriarchal family, I should say.
Yeah, so that's a wonderful, wonderful little thing. So, at the beginning of Mark, Simon Peter's mother-in-law apparently lived with him, because when Jesus went to Peter's house, he found his mother-in-law sick. It says in chapter 1, verse 30, "But Simon Peter's wife's mother lay sick with a fever, and they told him about her at once. So he came and took her by the hand and lifted her up, and immediately the fever left her, and she served them." So, in the rest of Mark, it's really made clear that your illness is usually the result of your sin, and if you want to be healed, you need to have your sins forgiven and get an exorcism to drive out the demons who have entered your body through your sin. So perhaps the mother-in-law's sin was not serving the men in her life well enough, since that's the first thing she does after being healed. However, after this, when Peter leaves to follow Jesus, we never hear from his wife or his family again.
And he wouldn't have an obligation to them, correct?
Yes. So it's very interesting that the women are having this huge obligation to the men, but the men seem to have little to no reciprocal.
And leave and become disciples, and they're not required by the new law to have anything to do with their family.
Mm-hmm.
So again, it's once again another bizarre practice or intonation that is completely against what we are constantly told is Christian family values.
Yes.
I mean, this is a justification for abandonment, what we would call.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And especially like in an era where women's capacity to work or to hold a job was so demonized, and and they aren't being allowed to remarry because that makes them sinners. So you have these women who are suddenly being cast out onto the street with no kind of backup or solution.
Maybe so if Jesus and his disciples come to town and you're a woman, maybe if you're very sick or dying or dead, you could be healed. But besides that, that would be really bad news, potentially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's very strange how that side of it doesn't seem to even be considered by the authors. So there's this kind of constant back and forth between how you should treat your family, and in particular the women in your family. There doesn't seem to be very much consistency. The justification for the difference in treatment is given explicitly in Mark chapter 14. And starting at verse 3, and being in Bethany at the house of Simon the leper, he sat at the table. A woman came having an alabaster flask of very costly oil of spikenard, and she broke the flask and poured it over his head. But there were some there who were indignant among themselves and said, "Why was this fragrant oil wasted? For it might have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor." They criticized her sharply. But Jesus said, "Let her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a good work for me. For the poor you will have with you always, and whenever you wish, you may do them good, but me you have not always. She has done what she could. She has come beforehand to anoint my body for burial. Assuredly I say to you, wherever this gospel is preached in the whole world, what this woman has done will also be told as a memorial to her." So the justification is basically that you treat the dying and doomed people differently from the way you treat the living. And to the author of Mark, this wasn't just Jesus who was dying, it was everyone. Everyone was going to die, or was doomed. And
phraseology, it's end times.
Yeah, he believed that he was facing the apocalypse, and so the correct thing to do was to act differently than you would if you weren't. So that really brings into question the relevance of his teachings to modern life, because
any of it. I mean, that millennialism really underpins this gospel, this entire gospel. That's the whole idea, is we must act differently because the world is going to end. But we know the world didn't end in 73 or whatever, 70, yeah. Yes, the temple was destroyed, but the world didn't end.
Yeah, and so acting as if the world is ending is counterproductive to you and to...
Christians have done it since then.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, they've barely stopped acting like the world is always ending.
Yeah, and I think that really gets in the way of...
that we are in end times, so...
Yeah, and I really think that gets in the way of living your life and doing good.
Because if you think everything's a lost cause, that we're already, at the end, it's like, well, fuck the world. Literally, fuck the world, we're going to heaven,
Since these authors really seem to believe that the world was ending, they really wanted to discourage marriage and procreation, but not always abandoning your family entirely. So, as we see in Mark chapter 13, starting at verse 14, "So when you see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing where it ought not, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop go not down into the house, nor enter to take anything out of his house. And let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. And pray that your flight may not be in the winter, For in those days there will be tribulation such as there has not been since the beginning of creation, which God created until this time, nor ever shall be. And unless the Lord had shortened those days, no flesh would be saved, but for the elect's sake, whom he chose, he shortened those days.
So we see the basis of many different Christian ideas, such as the elect, which survives in some sects, in that language, and then also talking more about what would then be, eventually become known in the 1800s as the rapture. Tribulation is something we still hear very often as sign, and that'll be once the Antichrist has emerged, and the theology got more complicated, but you can see a lot of the basis for many of these theological ideas in this gospel.
Yes. And so this passage refers to the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. As we'd spoken about like 2 episodes ago, you can date prophecies not by what they say is going to happen, but by what they say will happen going wrong. So the world obviously didn't end in 70 to 75 CE, but the authors of Mark clearly believed that it would. The number of people who had died in the sacking of Jerusalem was enormous. Many people had lost their entire families. The entire choir of priests burned to death on the altar, singing Sunday psalm. It wasn't actually a Sunday, but that's another issue. That's another long story.
Details. That's never stopped Christianity.
Well, it's very interesting. They sang Sunday psalm because it had to do more with resurrection than I think it was Wednesday's song or Thursday's song when the temple was actually destroyed. So they were clearly thinking more about their afterlife as they were dying in a fire, which is it's kind of, it's led to later authors believing that because they did this, they were doing it in a moment of prophecy, and therefore the Messiah will come on a Sunday. So that's very interesting. Yeah. Josephus put the casualties at 1.1 million, although it was probably more like a third of that. But within this context, it's somewhat easy to see why they'd write such an apocalyptic book, claiming that the world was ending.
And in this sense, it is very convincing, the view which sees Christianity as a millennialist, messianic reaction to the promise of Judaism fading when the temple's destroyed.
I want to briefly go on a tangent about the abomination of desolation, because I've had some interesting thoughts about it recently. The abomination of desolation, standing where it ought not, was used by the Maccabees as prophetic justification for their revolt after Antiochus IV slaughtered a pig in the temple. I'm sure that the author of Mark felt that if a dead pig on the altar could be called the abomination of desolation, dead priests on the altar was far more worthy of the title. However, I'm not sure if Antiochus was intent on sacrilege when he sacrificed that pig. It may have been a case of lost in translation, especially since all the accounts we have were taken from his enemies. So, looking at it from his point of view, he was marching through Judea on his way to Egypt, and he saw the temple. He would have asked what it was and been told it was a temple to the great god or something to that effect. He would probably have thought to himself, oh good, I'm only a few days march from my big battle in Egypt. I should probably offer a sacrifice for my victory. So he probably would have gone to see what he could give as a sacrifice, found a pig, and gave it to Jason the high priest, who was a Hellenistic Jew, for sacrifice to the great god, who he understood to be Zeus. Jason didn't have much of a problem with that, and he offered the pig. He probably thought, well, God doesn't accept pigs from us, but this guy isn't a Jew, and therefore God will probably accept it. So then the Maccabees see this as an opportunity because Jason is offering pigs to Zeus on the altar, probably on threat of death, and they take the opportunity to kill him for blasphemy and install themselves as the new heads of the religious lives of the people, since they were a competing clan of priests, and incidentally as kings of the nation. And if Antiochus found out about this revolt, what he probably heard was, oh, they say that there was sacrilege, and so they're cleaning it up for the great God, and that they want to call themselves kings right now. And he probably thought to himself, oh, what a wonderful precaution. That is so kind of them. They are trying to save me from the wrath of the God coming down on the king for the sacrilege. What nice people. And now he's totally demonized in Jewish mythology. It's just such a wonderful irony. So that was that tangent over. Let's go back to Mark. The rest of Jesus' interactions with women through to Mark chapter 15 are him performing miracles for them. There are 2 women healed by Jesus in Mark chapter 5, a 12-year-old girl and an older woman. The woman seems to have some kind of uterine problem, as the passage said she's had a bloody discharge for several years, and that she gave all she had to doctors, but no one had a cure. She reaches out and grabs Jesus' clothes, and he tells her that her faith has healed her and to go in peace. The 12-year-old girl is the daughter of a rabbi, allegedly, and dies before her father returns with Jesus. Jesus downplays the miracle of resurrecting her from the dead by telling the professional mourners gathered outside that she isn't dead, she's only asleep, then goes and raises the girl from the dead. She gets up and she eats. It's very strange that the authors would claim that she was the daughter of a rabbi, since rabbi then didn't mean what it means today. Today, it's just a general title that means religious scholar, and just about anyone can claim the title with no training. But that wasn't what it meant then. In those days, most religious power was centralized within the Sanhedrin, and anyone who held the title of rabbi was a member of the Sanhedrin, because those 2 terms were synonymous at the time.
And tell us what Sanhedrin is.
The Sanhedrin is a council of 70 men that allegedly derived their power from being the chosen descendants of 70 men who were directly appointed by Moses. So Moses selects 70 men. God gives them special power to judge over the people. These 70 men each choose disciples, and they train these disciples, and then when they're dying, they pick one of them to be a new member of the Sanhedrin. So the way that you get membership was to be the student of another member. So they often, these 70 people, this school, if you were, or this organization of 70 people, often disagreed with each other very bitterly, and they did have a lot of control over the titles and the social lives of the rest of Jewry, and that did drive them to work together most of the time and not engage in direct conflict with each other. But as we mentioned earlier, that incident between Jason and the Maccabees was one example of them not working together. So most of these rabbis had been trained from very young childhood to become the next member of the Sanhedrin, and they sat at the feet is the term of the master. So in Mark chapter 7, Jesus is passing through a non-Jewish area, and a woman asks him for a miracle, and he declines on the basis that she's not nearly as good as a Jew, and compared to them she's not even human. In Mark chapter 7, starting at verse 25, for a woman whose young daughter had an unclean spirit heard about him, and she came and fell at his feet. The woman was a Greek, a Syrophoenician by birth, and she kept asking him to cast the demon out of her daughter. But Jesus said to her, let the children be filled first, for it is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the little dogs. She answered and said to him, yes, Lord, yet even the little dogs under the table eat from the children's crumbs. And he said to her, "For this saying, go your way, the demon has gone out of your daughter." And when she had come to her house, she found the demon gone out, and her daughter lying on the bed. So she accepts his judgment that she is a dog compared to the Jews, but asks him to help her anyway, and that's why he does. His view of her and her daughter is obviously not nearly as good as his view of the other women in his life, which already left a lot to be desired. And this goes back to also what I was saying earlier about how Mark probably felt that non-Jews would become the slaves of Jews.
Yeah, that was the... Would that be part, like a stage of the apocalypse?
Yeah. The prevailing wisdom had it being a very integral part of the apocalypse.
Social supremacy, like as we've said, has run through Judaism from the very beginning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Going back to the other women in Mark, Herodias, the wife of Herod, she's one of the most evil women of the New Testament, according to Mark. She got mad at John the Baptist for condemning her for marrying up from a guy named Philip to his brother who was king. And then she sent her daughter to dance for Herod, and when Herod gets either aroused or just really pleased with the dancing, he offers to give the girl whatever she wants, and she asks for John the Baptist's head on a platter to give to her mother. She gets John the Baptist executed for for her mom. It's wonderful. In Mark chapter 15, which is the second to last chapter, it's the first chapter in the entire book where women are mentioned as following Jesus for anything more than healing. It says in chapter 15, verse 40, there were also women who looking on from afar at his crucifixion, among whom were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the Less and of Joses, and Salome, who also followed him and ministered to him while he was in Galilee, and many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem. And Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of Joses observed where he was laid. Now when the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices that they might come and anoint him. Very early in the morning, on the first day of the week, which is Sunday by their counts, they came to the tomb when the sun had risen, and they said among themselves, "Who will roll away the stone from the door of the tomb for us?" But when they looked up, they saw that the stone had been rolled away, for it was very large. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man clothed in a white robe, sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you into Galilee. There you will see him, as he has said to you." And they went out quickly and fled from the tomb, for they trembled and were amazed, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And that's where the book ends in the original manuscripts.
That's kind of like, the Sopranos ending that pissed everyone off. Just, black screen.
Yep. It ends on a cliffhanger. So the women who apparently had followed Jesus, although no one felt it was important to mention them until the very last chapters, they watch the crucifixion, they go to the tomb, and they don't find him there, but don't bother to tell anyone. In the added on verses, Jesus then appears to Mary Magdalene, and we get some extra backstory on her. It says in verse 9, "Now when he rose on the first day of the week, he first appeared to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had cast 7 demons. And she went and told those who had been with him as they mourned and wept. And when they heard he was alive and had been seen by her, they did not believe." So they didn't see it as very important to listen to women, even if they did talk.
Peter, who was especially anti-Mary Magdalene?
It was,
Well, maybe I'm thinking of a Gnostic gospel. I don't remember. Who said they didn't believe her?
I think it was Thomas who didn't believe until he stuck his hand in Jesus' side. So yeah, it's great. They didn't listen.
So the added portions, they actually reveal what becomes kind of Mary Magdalene's signature, which is that she was the first person to that Jesus appears to after his crucifixion and burial, essentially, correct?
Yeah, and it also adds that he had cast the demons out of her. In the earlier manuscript, she's just a follower of his. There's nothing about demons.
So this woman is actually elevated in some of the later traditions. What do you make of that?
I find it very interesting. She's not she gets demons, so she's not exactly elevated. She's also a little bit demonized.
But at the same time, you would think it is such an honor that he would choose her to appear to first.
Yes.
That's whatever prestige she has in the tradition, it really comes from that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's very interesting that even in this, she's still getting a mixed bag. You know?
We can't really know, I guess, beyond generalizations. I'm sure there were versions in which that coda was not there, and that it was more black and white, that she was positive, and then it could have very well been edited. As we know, invariably these were very little pieces at a time, mostly by scribes and sometimes theologians and sometimes councils, but maybe someone felt that it was a little too positive about her and needed to take her off a peg.
Yeah. The women in the Book of Mark as a whole are either too emotional and can't be trusted, or they're entirely unfeeling and will stab you in the back. Abandoning them doesn't seem like it's a bad thing. It doesn't seem to be judged very harshly, and it's mostly the women who are blamed when stuff goes wrong.
It's semi-exalted position for Mary Magdalene.
So that's the Book of Mark, and we'll cover Matthew next time.
Giving us this next edition of Women and the Abrahamic Tradition. I'm Jacob Music, and you're listening to Voice of the Revolution Radio.